Last time we spoke about the Gapsin coup. Li Hangzhang snipped the bud of war before it could bloom after the Imo uprising and the Daewongun stole back power in Korea. The Daewongun was spanked, sent into exile yet again, but now Korea had become greatly factionalized. The progressives and conservatives were fighting bitterly to set Korea on a Japanese or Chinese path to modernization. This led radicals like Kim Il-kung to perform the Gapsin coup, which was terribly planned and failed spectacularly. Japan and China were yet again tossed into conflict in Korea, but China firmly won the day for she had more forces to bear. Japan licked her wounds and went home, learning a bitter lesson. That lesson was, next time, bring more friends to the party. But today we're going to be taking a side quest, for many events were occurring in China, and one that brought yet again another foreign war. This episode is how France ended up in Indochina. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Khoi Revolt. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I have a 2-part series on the First Sino-Japanese War. And just a friendly reminder, I myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And over there you can find exclusive content like podcasts. This month's exclusive podcast is on General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident. Check it out, it'll mean a lot to me. As I said a while back, and I do apologize for repeating myself, I wanted to try and hit some events that don't necessarily fit the something like 4 to 5 episodes it's been taking to explain how the First Sino-Japanese War came about. And even as I am writing this, on my personal channel, someone commented, "Hey, please don't forget to do a podcast on the Panthay Rebellion." Oh boy. So I chose to keep the Panthay Rebellion out of the Dungan Revolt episode, though many do like to bundle those ones up. But rest assured, I am going to do the Panthay Rebellion. It'll most likely come out after the series we're about to jump into. If for some reason it falls through my fingers, rest assured, probably put it on my Patreon. Again, you can find that at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Sorry for being a scumbag. But honestly, it is taking forever to get to the First Sino-Japanese War. I say it constantly on this channel. I thought it was going to take one episode to explain the events, but now I'm doing multiple series, it seems, before even getting to it. Now, the series we're about to jump into, it is about the Sino-French War, and it's actually something that a large portion of my Vietnamese audience members for my personal channel, the YouTube channel, have been begging me to do for a very long time. Now, this series focuses on the history of China, and as such, it fails to mention the experiences of, China's neighbors quite often. For example, while Western nations like Britain were courting the Qing dynasty, trying to open up further trade outside the Canton system, nations like France were likewise exploring and trying to exploit places like modern-day Vietnam. During the early 17th century, France began to establish relations with Vietnam by sending the Jesuit missionary Alexandre de Rhodes. Alexandre de Rhodes was the first to write catechism in the Vietnamese alphabet, and upon returning to France in 1650, he advised the Catholic Church they needed to dispatch bishops over to Vietnam to help develop her Roman Catholic population, estimated to be around 100,000 strong. He also warned that they must not allow what occurred in Japan to happen in Vietnam, referencing the Shimbata Rebellion. Here is some of what he had to say. "We have all reason to fear that what happened to the Church of Japan could also happen to the Church of Vietnam, because these kings in Tonkin, as well as Cochin China, are very powerful and accustomed to war. It is necessary that the Holy See, by its own movement, give soldiers to these oriental regions where Christians multiply in marvelous ways, lest without bishops, these men die without sacrament and manifestly risk damnation." Alexandre de Rhodes' efforts helped create the Paris Foreign Mission Society, and soon the French East India Company began operating in Southeast Asia. Throughout the 18th century, the Jesuits' missionary work and trade were very successful in Vietnam, and this even led to military assistance. The French aided Nguyen to retake his lands that had been taken from his family during a rebellion. The French were able to protect Nguyen, who became Emperor Galang, and relations were fairly good with France, until his death, whereupon relations fell considerably. The Nguyen dynasty increasingly viewed the Catholic missionaries as a threat to their control. The French missionaries were soon being persecuted, and then a revolt occurred in Cochin China known as the Khoi Revolt of 1833 to 1835. French Catholic missionaries, Vietnamese Catholics, and Chinese settlers revolted against the current emperor, Minh Mang. Minh Mang quelled the revolt in 3 years while simultaneously fighting off a Siamese offensive. The revolt caused a dramatic increase in the persecution of Catholics, leading to the execution of many missionaries. France tried to send diplomats to work out a peace deal with Minh Mang, but he would not have any of it. In 1825, he made an edict. "The Westerners' perverse religion confuses the hearts of men. For a long time, many Western ships have come to trade with us and to introduce Catholic missionaries into our country. These missionaries make the people's hearts crooked, thus destroying our beautiful customs. Truly, this is a great disaster for our land. Our purpose being to prevent our people from abandoning our orthodox way, we must accordingly completely eliminate these abuses." Minh Mang, unlike his predecessor, had no illusions about Catholics, missionaries, nor the West in general. He sought isolationism. He was a very conservative leader, and he abided by Confucianism. During his 21 years of rule, he expanded his empire to acquire territory from parts of modern-day Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. However, after the First Opium War saw the Qing dynasty humiliated by Britain, Minh Mang attempted to build an alliance with European powers by sending a delegation out in 1840 led by Ton Tat Tung. They were received in Paris by Prime Minister Machasu, but King Louis-Philippe shunned the delegation, and the Vatican urged a rebuke for, quote, "the enemy of the religion." The delegates tried to offer France a trade monopoly in exchange for military support in case they were being attacked by another Western power, but it was all in vain. After this, the delegation tried a similar treaty with the Americans, but this also failed. Emperor Minh Mang died, and he was succeeded by his eldest son, Thiao Chi, who upheld the anti-Catholic stance of the Nguyen dynasty, but did make some efforts to thwart conflicts and handed over to France 5 imprisoned missionaries in 1840. Thiao Chi would be dealt a hard hand of cards, as during the 1840s his empire was being hit by a global cholera pandemic that killed roughly 8% of his nation's population. Meanwhile, his father's isolationist policies meant the empire's economy was hurting. Back over in France, in 1843, the French foreign minister François Guizot sent a fleet to East Asia led by Admiral Jean-Baptiste Thomas Médy-Cécile. And oh my god, wow to that name. All first names. Literally imagine someone in English called John, Jacob, Ryan, Jack, Kyle. And I'm just going to say it here and now. I've already written the 5 episodes of this series, and there is a lot of old French guys with names like this. It is absolutely ridiculous how they named their children back then. Now, the reason for the expedition was to respond to the new situation in China, as Britain had just defeated her in 1842 and thus the door was busted wide open, so to say. The French thinking was, while Britain began exploiting China in the north, perhaps France could counterbalance this by trying to puncture China in the south. And of course, France was not openly stating this. Thus, officially, she sent the mission to, quote, to support British efforts with the Qing dynasty and to fight against the persecution of French missionaries within Vietnam. Admiral Jean-Baptiste went to Vietnam in 1845 to try and get the release of one bishop, Dominique Lefebvre, who had been condemned to death. Lefebvre had gone to Vietnam in 1835, and it was then illegal to work as a missionary. He was caught performing missionary actions and he received the death penalty. A U.S. captain named John Percival of the USS Constitution attempted to gain his release but failed, so he turned to Admiral Jean-Baptiste. Jean-Baptiste managed to smooth things over and obtained Lefebvre's release. And Lefebvre simply snuck right back into Vietnam and got himself caught yet again, and he was in the same situation by 1847. Thus, in 1847, Admiral Jean-Baptiste dispatched to Vietnam 2 warships, the 54-gun frigate Gloire and the 24-gun corvette Victorieuse, under Captain Lapierre and Charles Rigaud de Genoy. They went to Turin to try and free Bishop Lefebvre and another bishop named Duclos, and they wanted to try and get the Vietnamese to allow for Catholics to worship again in Vietnam. Perhaps they were getting tired of showing up every time a priest got imprisoned. Negotiations began, but it seems Lefebvre's being a second-time offender made the Vietnamese believe the French were pulling a fast one, thus it all fell apart. The negotiations dragged on until April the 15th of 1847, while 6 Vietnamese corvettes snuck up and attacked the French warships anchored in the Bay of Touraine. The French retaliated, and they sank 4 of the Vietnamese corvettes, disabled the 5th, and inflicted roughly 1,200 casualties. It was quite a one-sided brawl. The French assert the Vietnamese had deceived them by prolonging the negotiations in order to surprise attack them. Colonel Alfred Tomasy, a historian who covered this period, had this to say about the event. Thiauchi, indignant with his interference, decided to end the affair with a surprise attack. His plan was to invite the French officers to a banquet, kill them, and then burn and sink the ships. But Commandant Lapierre was on his guard and he declined the invitation. The Mandarins, seeing the first part of the program go astray, passed on to the second. They attacked. Colonel Alfred Tomasy also gives us a pretty good description of the battle in Touraine Bay. Gradually, the enemy's war fleet, consisting of 5 corvettes with covered batteries, several bricks, and a large number of junks, gathered in the bay, and one morning, without prior warning, attacked the French vessels. These, as their armament was far superior, had little difficulty destroying the entire enemy fleet, but they had to get underway thereafter, abandoning the Christians to the vengeance of their persecutors. In the end, Lefebvre and Duclos were released. The Vietnamese were stunned by the dramatic disparity in firepower between their warships and the French. It showcased to many Vietnam's isolationist policies had left her extremely vulnerable to Western powers, and so her people began demanding modernization efforts. Things gradually began to get worse for the Catholic community in Vietnam. In 1856, the French diplomat Louis-Charles de Montigny was sent to Asia to try and secure trade agreements. He first went to the Kingdom of Siam, where a treaty was signed on August the 15th to facilitate trade, religious freedoms, in order for Siam to gain access to French warship technology. Then Montigny turned to Vietnam, arriving the next year where he demanded they establish a consulate in Hue to allow for free trade and to end their persecution of the Catholic community. The Vietnamese court rejected all of these outright. When Montigny returned to France, having failed in Vietnam, Napoleon III decided enough was enough, and he dispatched a military force of 3,000 men to Vietnam, led by Rigaud de Genoy. France actually had a few reasons they were dispatching forces, as it was not just exclusive to Vietnam. Do remember, the Second Opium War was just kicking off, so these forces were actually also sent to deal with China. It also did not help that the Nguyen Emperor, Du Dac, ordered the execution of 2 Spanish Catholic missionaries in 1857 as well. Thus, the Spanish likewise sent a punitive expeditionary force to join the French. Yes, Spain is getting involved in this one as well. Their first target was to be Touraine. The French force was led by Admiral Junot's flagship, the 50-gun frigate, Nemesis, alongside 2 corvettes, 5 steam gunboats, and 5 transports carrying 1,000 French Marines. By the way, small little tidbit of information here. If you listen to the names of most of these French warships, you will notice they are the same as their British counterparts. It's pretty much France just fucking with Britain. Oh, excuse my French. But the Spanish likewise brought a armed vessel called the Elcano, carrying 550 Spanish infantry and 450 Filipino chasseurs Tagal. Now, Touraine held 5 major forts on the western side of its peninsula, which covered the approach to the town. The French called these the Fort du Lagarde, Fort de l'Observatoire, Fort du Nord, Fort du Est, and the Fort du l'Est. They were accompanied by several shore batteries between them as well. The Vietnamese had a garrison of 2,000 Bien Binh, provincial soldiers led by Trong Cao Dao Chi, and the governor, Nam Nai, tossed in another 2,000 Cam Binh, central soldiers led by Dung Tong Lei Te Li. The Franco-Spanish force arrived at Touraine Bay during the night of August 31st, and at dawn, Admiral Rigaud de Junot demanded the 5 forts surrender outright. He received no response, and thus he ordered his flotilla to bombard them. The fort's response were on par with the Qing's performance during the Opium Wars. None of the Western ships received any damage. Rigaud de Junot landed some Marines who quickly seized Fort du Lagarde. They charged its defenders, chanting, "Vive l'Empereur!" The defenders were overrun, and soon the Fort de l'Est and the Fort de l'Ouest were taken likewise with ease. Elcano had anchored off the entrance of the Da Nang River and aided the forces by bombarding the 2 forts, causing the defenders to flee. Most of the Vietnamese defenders were able to flee the carnage from the offset of the bombardment, but those at the Fort l'Observatoire were not quick enough. The French stormed into the fort and inflicted heavy casualties upon them before taking the rest prisoner. And thus with this, the Franco-Spanish force were able to occupy Touraine and the Dien Xa Peninsula. However, upon occupying Touraine, suddenly the Westerners found themselves under siege. Admiral Rigaud de Junot surmised their forces at Touraine could achieve nothing under these circumstances, so he pulled them out and decided to try and find a new target. He considered Tonkin first, but ruled it out instead and chose Saigon. Saigon was chosen because of its strategic value. It was, after all, one of the main sources for food that fed the entire Vietnamese army. He left Capitaine de Vaison-Toyon at Touraine with 2 gunboats and a small garrison and took the rest of the forces south. The force spent 5 days gathering supplies in Cam Ranh Bay and then reached Cape Saint-Jacques on February the 10th. They bombarded the forts that defended its harbors into silence before storming them with Marines like they had done at Touraine. From Cape Saint-Jacques, they made a 5-day journey upriver, taking time here and there to bombard and storm riverside forts. The Vietnamese defenders fought them off tenaciously and managed to land some cannonade hits into ships like Dragon and Avalanche, inflicting hull damage. The defenders also tried to barricade the riverways behind the invaders, but the Europeans made sure to dispatch naval forces behind themselves to thwart these efforts periodically. Every time the Europeans attacked a fort or a river force, they made sure also to spike the enemy's weapons down or simply take them, thus reducing the enemy's materials. By the 15th, the Europeans were approaching some forts that defended Saigon's southern part. During the night, they snuck 2 armed forces to destroy a barricade the Vietnamese had made using boats tied up together, utilizing explosives. Dawn of the next day, the European warships anchored 800 meters from the forts and began their bombardment. They were so close, some of the Marine snipers in the warships' mastheads were able to pick off Vietnamese gunners along their walls. The Vietnamese responded as best as they could, but like the Qing dynasty during the Opium Wars, their outdated cannons were greatly overmatched. Soon, landing companies began to assault the forts, and by 8 a.m. the French and Spanish seized them. A few hours later, Capitaine Bernard Juguiberry took the Avalanche and scouted the citadel of Saigon, before sending a French-Spanish force to assault it. Once the Europeans entered the citadel, the defenders began fleeing, though they did return with 1,000 men to try and counterattack them. The Europeans managed to repel the counterattack, and by 10 a.m., the French and Spanish flags were raised over the citadel. The citadel of Saigon was enormous, and the Europeans could not spare the necessary men to man it, so Admiral de Rhodes decided to simply blow it up. Using 32 mines on March the 8th of 1859, the citadel was brought to ruins. Alongside this, the Europeans set fire to the rice granaries, which would burn for several months. The Europeans turned back to Turan, leaving a small garrison to hold Saigon, which would fight a few battles on its own before being forced to pull out. Taking Saigon proved to be a fruitless victory. Admiral Rigaud de Jesuit lost favor back home, and he was replaced in November of 1859 with Admiral François Page, with orders to obtain a treaty to protect Catholics in Vietnam, but not to seek territorial gains. Now, at the same time this was all occurring, there was an outbreak of the Austro-Sardinian War, and this meant that France would require large numbers of forces to go over to Italy, which the Vietnamese leadership quickly found out about. When Admiral Page began negotiations in November with the Vietnamese, they refused his moderate terms, believing that France was no longer in a position of strength because of her troubles in Italy. So in the meantime, Page reinforced the garrisons at Saigon and Da Nang, awaiting the conclusion of the Italian War so more troops would be available to him. But by 1860, the Second Opium War broke out, requiring France to send even more troops over to China, and Page was forced to relinquish much of his forces for the China expedition. In April, Page left Vietnam to go to Canton, leaving the defense of Saigon and the neighboring Chinese town of Cao Long under Capitaine de Vaisseau Jules Dariès. Dariès was left with 600 French Marines and 200 Spanish troops who were led by Colonel Palanca y Gutierrez. He also had on hand the corvettes Primoguet, Laplace, and Norzagarin. With such forces, he could not hope to withstand attacks from the Vietnamese, so he was forced to hire some Chinese and Vietnamese auxiliaries who would be placed in advanced posts for patrol. With his 1,000-man augmented force, in March they were attacked by a Vietnamese army roughly around 10,000 men in strength. This led to a long and bitter siege, while simultaneously Turan was facing a similar situation, and as I said, they were forced to pull out as a result over there. Dariès and his men fought the siege off from March of 1860 to February of 1861. However, during this time, the British and French forces had won the Battle of Palikao on September the 21st of 1860, thus relieving the need for their forces over in China. 70 ships led by Admiral Chanier, carrying 3,500 soldiers led by General de Varsagne, were quickly dispatched to Saigon. This naval force was the largest the Vietnamese had ever seen. Admiral Chanier's force reached their besieged allies in Saigon to find a Vietnamese army estimated to be around 32,000 men strong, led by Nguyen. The Vietnamese siege forces had their siege lines extending 12 kilometers long, centered around a village called Khoi. Luckily for us, Colonel Alfred Tomasi had a lot to write about the events, so here's a few passages. The first objective was the capture of the entrenched camp of Khoi. This was a rectangle measuring around 3,000 meters by 900 meters, divided into 5 compartments separated by traverses, and enclosed within walls 3.5 meters high and 2 meters thick. The camp was armed with more than 150 cannons of all calibers. Subsidiary defenses were piled up in front of its walls: wolf pits, ditches filled with water, palisades, and chevaux de frise. Bamboo was employed in the defenses with consummate art, and the walls were crowned with thorn bushes along their entire length. The number of enemy soldiers both in and around the fortified camp had grown steadily during the previous year. After the victory, we discovered from the muster rolls that there were 22,000 regular troops and 10,000 militiamen. There were also 15,000 men manning the forts along the upper course of the Donai. All of these men were under the command of Nguyen Chi Phuong, the most celebrated general in the Vietnamese army. The Europeans made their initial assault on February the 24th, moving their artillery into firing range of the siege lines. With bombardment support, the French and Spanish gradually attacked the fortifications, taking heavy casualties in the process. A second assault was made the very next day, starting at dawn, and again our friend Tomasi has a lengthy account of the day's battle. It is as follows. The action resumed at 5 a.m. on the 25th of February. The artillery advanced, facing east, enclosed by two columns of infantry. To the left, the engineers, the marine infantry, and the chasseurs. To the right, the Spanish infantry and the sailors. The sun, very low in the sky, was spoiling the aim of the cannons, and Lieutenant Colonel Crozat brought them forward by rapid bounds to within 200 meters of the enemy lines and ordered them to fire with case shot at the top of the ramparts. The firing was very heavy on our men, in the open, suffering appreciable casualties. Then the haversacks were laid on the ground, the sailors of the assault force reclaimed their scaling ladders, for up to then they were carried by the coolies, and the admiral ordered the charge to be sounded. The right column, led by du Capitaine de Vassenot de l'Abelin, crossed the wolf pits, the ditches, and the chevaux de frise which extended for more than 100 meters in front of the enemy work, under intense fire, and were the first to reach the parapet. Most of the scaling ladders, which were very light, had been broken during the advance. Only 3 were left, which were placed along the wall, and the sailors of the assault force, who could not find a place there, climbed on the shoulders of their comrades. This time the fighting was bitter indeed. The first men to reach the summit were killed, but others took their place, throwing grenades inside. Then, using grappling hooks, they breached the perimeter fence and entered the fort. They then found themselves in an enclosed compartment swept by the fire from the neighboring compartment, to which they could make no reply. It was a critical situation, and they suffered heavy losses. Finally, several resolute men, rallied by Lieutenant de Vassal-Jarez, succeeded in smashing in the gate and gave on to the other compartment with their axes, just as the engineers succeeded in breaking in, while the marine infantry and the chasseurs outflanked the enemy line on the left. The defenders were either killed where they stood or took to flight. The entire complex of the Khoi lines had fallen into our hands. The casualties for the second day were quite heavy, 12 dead and 225 wounded, and according to French reports, they estimated the Vietnamese had lost around 1,000 men, including Commander Nguyen. By seizing Qui Ha, the Europeans were able to take the offensive. Their first target was to be the city of My Tho. A smaller expeditionary force led by Capitaine Baudet aboard the Mang alongside the Alarme, Mitre, and some gunboats took a force of around 230 men to seize My Tho. They ran into 2 forts defending a creek leading to the city and began to bombard them. After the forts were neutralized, they ran continuously into barricades the Vietnamese forces had made to bar further passage. Then on April the 4th, the Europeans received reinforcements from Saigon in the form of 200 chasseurs, 200 sailors, 2 companies of marines, and some heavy artillery. Capitaine Baudet relinquished command over to Capitaine Le Courrier du Kilo, and he went to work having their expeditionary force fight its way through the barricades, which began to become increasingly well defended. By April the 8th, the expedition was reinforced a few more times, including more gunboats, prompting the Vietnamese to send fire ships against them. The French naval forces were able to hook the 2 fire ships and tow them away. On the 10th, a scouting party led by Capitaine de Chaffeau managed to reach the walls of My Tho, exchanging fire with its defenders before returning to report. Capitaine Kilo decided to press forward his warships to hit more forts defending the passage to My Tho, until they finally got in range of My Tho's walls. As Europeans prepared their assault of the city, suddenly a flotilla led by Admiral Page showed up taking the Mekong River passage, and he bombarded My Tho by sea, which surrendered on the 12th. After taking My Tho, the French offered peace terms to Thuy Duc, but this time demanded the cession of Saigon province, an indemnity payment of 4 million, free trade rights, and freedom of religion. Thuy Duc was open to conceding on the religion aspect, but rejected the others outright. Thus, the French occupied My Tho and looked for new targets. Meanwhile, Thuy Duc had lost numerous materials and received many casualties for his efforts against the French-Spanish invaders. His forces simply could not meet the enemy on the open battlefield, and thus he now sought to shift towards guerrilla warfare. He dispatched men to venture into the enemy-held territories and organize resistance groups. Soon, Saigon and Mito provinces were finding themselves in a state of siege. The French and Spanish forces began to fan out into the countryside hunting guerrillas, but as you can imagine, this led to terrible violence against the common people. Admiral Charnier was replaced by Admiral Louis-Adolphe Bonnat in November of 1861. When he arrived, he found the forces were being increasingly attacked by guerrillas. One band of guerrilla forces attacked the French Lorcha Esperance by luring the vessel out and ambushing her. 17 French and Filipino sailors were killed and the ship was burned down. This prompted Bonnat to launch a major reprisal campaign against the province of Binua. Again, our dear old friend Tomasi has a lengthy passage about the battle and capture of Binua. It is as follows. The enemies had established defense works on the routes leading to Binua. They had built an entrenched camp held by 3,000 men at Mihua, midway between Binua and Saigon, and they obstructed the course of the Donnai with 9 solid barricades and stockades. The admiral decided to attack simultaneously by land and water. He ordered the detached posts to remain on the defensive and to concentrate all disposable forces before Saigon. All being ready, an ultimatum was issued on December the 13th, going unanswered. The columns set out for daybreak on the 14th of December. The first column, commanded by Chef du Bataillon Comte and consisting of 2 companies of chasseurs à pied, 100 Spaniards, and 50 horsemen with 4 motors, made for Go-Come, which it captured at 7:30 a.m. A second column, consisting of 100 Spaniards and a battalion of marine infantry with 2 cannons, under the orders of Lieutenant Colonel Dominic Diego, placed itself before the camp of Mihao. At the same time, Capitaine du Vaisseau Lebris, with 2 companies of sailors, advanced on the Donnai, taking in reverse the batteries on the right bank. Finally, a flotilla of armed launches, having followed the creeks as far as Zaitgalkong, cannonaded the works which were also bombarding the gunboats anchored in the Donnai, under the orders of Lieutenant de Vaisseau-Harel of l'Avalanche. The forts replied energetically, and the gunboat Alarme was hit by 54 balls and had her mainmast nearly destroyed. But once the defenders saw themselves threatened by a land attack, they hastily evacuated the forts, one which blew up and the others were occupied. The sailors toiled throughout the night to demolish the barrages, while the naval hydrographer Manin sounded the passes. The first obstacles having been destroyed, the 2 infantry columns joined hands in the front of camp of Mihao on the 15th of December. The marine infantry attacked the enemy's center, while the chasseurs menaced his right and the Spaniards his left, and the cavalry made a turning movement to cut off his retreat. The enemies panicked and took to flight. Admiral Bonnat, aboard the dispatch vessel Onzin, ascended the river and exchanged cannon shots with the citadel. On the 16th of December, the troops crossed the Donnai and occupied Binhao, which the enemy's soldiers had evacuated, but not before burning alive numerous Christian prisoners. We took there 48 cannons and 15 armed junks. The operation cost us only 2 men dead and several wounded. Even after taking Binhao, the guerrillas persisted to amp up their attacks. The guerrilla forces around Mito began to snipe European columns marching along the roads, and a French gunboat carrying troops was blown up via sabotage. Admiral Bonnat believed these actions to be the work of Vietnamese forces operating in Vien Long, so he began to campaign to seize it. March the 20th, his naval forces reached the fortress of Vien Long, and he quickly landed 700 French and 300 Spanish troops, led by Lieutenant Colonel Reboul, to attack. And our faithful primary source, Tomasi, tells us this. On the 22nd of March, they crossed Tuarios under fire and advanced into view of the enemy batteries, which had been fighting a violent artillery duel with the gunboats. During the night, after a 7-hour struggle, all the batteries were occupied, and on the following day we entered the citadel, where we found 68 cannons and a considerable quantity of materials. The defenders of Vien Long had long fallen back to some earthwork defenses 20 kilometers west of Mito, so Bonnat sent forces to attack them while he consolidated Vien Long. As the forces marched to attack the defenders, the loss of My Thao, Binua, and Minh Mang had severely demoralized the Vietnamese leadership. Thus, in April of 1862, De Duc announced he sought peace terms. In May, following some preliminary meetings at Hue, the French corvette Forbin went to Tehran to meet with the Vietnamese delegation. And yet again, Tomazi, our very faithful source for this entire episode it seems, tells us the French waited for 2 days for the Vietnamese to show up. And then this occurred. On the third day, an old paddle wheel corvette, de Aigle de Mer, was seen slowly leaving the Touraine River. Her beflagged keel was in a state of dilapidation that excited the laughter of our sailors. It was obvious that she had not gone to sea for many years. Her cannons were rusty, her crews in rags, and she was towed by a 40-oared junk and escorted by a crowd of light barges. She carried the plenipotentiaries of De Duc. Forbin took her under tow and brought her to Saigon, where the negotiations were briskly concluded. On the 5th of June, a treaty was signed aboard the vessel Du Pierre, moored before Saigon. The result was the Treaty of Saigon, which legalized the Catholic faith in Vietnam and the secession of Dic Thang, Ga Ding, Bien Hoa, and some other islands over to France. The ports of Truong, Ba Lac, and Nguyen were opened and France was given trade rights. On top of all of that, the Vietnamese were to pay an indemnity worth $1 million to France and Spain over a 10-year period. And thus the colony of Cochin China with its capital of Saigon was acquired by France, which would start an ongoing conflict only to end with the United States of America pulling out of Vietnam in 1975. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, if you want to fast forward to the First Sino-Japanese War, I have a 2-part episode on it. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast over there is on General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. I honestly thought I would be able to do the Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885 in a single episode. And yet again, I was gravely mistaken. Thus, next time, we will continue the story of France and Southeast Asia.